درود مردم شریف ایران. من شهریار افشار هستم، میزبان شما در Politics 365. امروز مجددا پروفسور اریک لاب از فلوریدا اینترنشنال یونیورسیتی به برنامه پیوسته. ایشون یه ریسرچر هستن، پروفسور خاورمیانه و مدت هاست در این زمینه فعالیت کردن. این برنامه در دو بخش اجرا خواهد شد. این بخش اول ما گفتگومون رو محدود میکنیم به انتخابات ایران و چه اثری انتخابات دکتر پزشکیان ممکنه داشته باشه به واقعا در آینده ایران. و بخش دوم تمرکز میکنیم روی انتخابات آمریکا و این کاندیدای الان ترامپ و بایدن و چه اثری و انتخابات یکی از این دوتا فرد به آینده ایران خواهد داشت. بقیه برنامه به انگلیسی تهیه شده، خلاصه از اون ما رو ببخشید. Eric Lobb, welcome back. Thanks so much for joining us. There's never a shortage of complex things to talk about and dive into. As I explained to our guests in Farsi, the first path we're going to have is a conversation about the Iranian election, the expectations, and then we'll talk about the American elections and those expectations in a separate conversation. So tell us about what you've seen. I mean, I know that the Middle East is reacting to the presidential election in Iran. Most people are saying, look, he's just a proxy, he's just a regime crony. You're not going to see holistic foreign policy change. And yet, as human nature, we still hope against hope, wish that someone could bring change and alleviate the pressures on the Iranian people. How do you see it and Pezeshkian's role in the future?
Well, the election was certainly a surprise on some levels. And, while the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council can set the parameters of the election, and it was surprising in itself that they allowed a reformist candidate into the mix among, 6 total candidates, 5 of whom were different shades of hardline and conservative. And all of a sudden you see this reformist candidate, Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian, who's in the mix. And then who wins by 1 million votes approximately in the first round, although it doesn't get to 50% with Saeed Jalali, and then won by a more comfortable margin on July 5th by 3 million votes. But that in itself was a surprise. I mean, of course, no one expected the abrupt death of the late President Ibrahim Raisi. It seemed like the conservatives and hardliners were circling the wagons and further consolidating their power among all this internal and external pressure that they were facing, and paving the path for a smooth succession between the Supreme Leader and what was presumably going to be Raisi or maybe someone else, close to his camp. And then all of a sudden we have this shift. And again, it's, as you said, it's not going to be a really substantial or dramatic shift necessarily in Iran's domestic and foreign policies, with the Supreme Leader and even the IRGC having the final say on some very important areas. But nonetheless, it does change the tone to some extent. And the president can play a role to some extent in formulating the policies, peripherally and with his cabinet ministers, and we'll see who he appoints to these cabinet positions. And so, again, there's a question of why the regime or the establishment or the system, the nizam, would even allow a reformist into the mix. And many observers and analysts say it's because they were just dealing with such a detrimental legitimacy crisis with these low election turnouts, in the 40% since 2021 for the presidential election, the parliamentary election. Even these past rounds of presidential election, you saw a very low figure in the first round of 39%, and then close to 50% in the latest second round. But a regime that once boasted these participation rates of 60 to 70%, it's not even close to that. So even though there's now a reformist in the position of the presidency, there's still a lot of disillusionment in Iranian society, where many people boycotted the vote. They wanted nothing to do with the regime. They don't want to play any part in legitimizing it. And so that's still going to be an issue, even with this reformist politician. in the mix now for the regime moving forward.
Right. It's fascinating. Even this number, 40%. I mean, I'm not going to say I don't know anybody that voted, but most people are observers are saying we didn't see any lines in polling stations. God help those poor Iranians that tried to vote outside of Iran because they were just pummeled with diaspora anger and wrath. I've seen it on social media, and everyone has seen it. Traders and all kinds of names calling at the polling stations, all kinds of conflicts happening in London and Europe and US. But in Iran, I mean, there are hardly any lines. I remember there was a time where they would even run out of ballots. There were so many people eager to vote. So clearly, since Iran has no open and transparent election process, who knows? I mean, I don't want to lead to conspiracy. I like to speak in facts, but even the number is illegitimate. I mean, the fact that they say they've X number percentage voted. So that's one illegitimate. And then the second is, like you say, the puzzling question is why did they let a reformist even in the mix under the tent, which only serves their purposes to placate the masses, right? So they trumped up this fast overnight election, and they put this reformist in the mix. They let him win, just so they can calm the masses. Look, we are a democracy. I mean, I don't want to. That sounds like what they can do without any accountability. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, sure, the supreme leader recognizes that they have a major legitimacy crisis. And so they, you could say, I mean, they set the parameters of this election without, I mean, at least, on the surface, fully determining the outcome. He's still, and this is kind of an anomaly because in the past, the reformists, centrists like Rouhani, they won on very high voter turnout. So this shows now that a candidate like that can win still with a very low turnout. So that's kind of an interesting anomaly, I think. And because, I think, the voters still sent a message that they want change. They want to see economic improvement, and they tie that to sanctions relief as Pezeshkian did during his campaign and during, his debates. They want a relaxation of social restrictions and religious restrictions, which led to the Mahsa Amini woman life freedom protests. These are just some of the key issues. And of course, he's from Tabriz, and so there's also an ethnic dimension here in terms of maybe having greater rights for ethnic minorities in Iran. But at the same time, I mean, even with them putting forward a reformist candidate, the numbers are still not good. Again, having a first round of 39%, and even, I think it was like the voter participation rate was 48 to 49%. So when you look at the vote, it was about 30 million votes out of a total number of voters of 60 million, and still 30 million stayed away from the polls.
Yeah.
Which is a big number.
Yeah.
Based on what they're used to. And so, if Iranians are losing hope in the ballot box to have any type of meaningful change, then the options become more protests or political violence, right? Or just complete apathy and disaffection with the system and more brain drain and human capital flight. I mean, they could try to paint a rosy picture, but it's still, it still just screams of legitimacy issues for this regime. Even, if you want to get conspiratorial and say, they put this reformist proxy out there to try to shore up their legitimacy, and they still weren't able to achieve that
Right.
on a grand scale.
Right. And, looking at those numbers, I mean, clearly, and I always say this to people, look, the regime has had 45 years to entrench itself in Iranian society. They had kids, they got grandkids, they got in-laws, they got people that work in the administration one way or another. That number alone may be in the millions that are tied to the regime in some way, which obviously they go and vote, and we've seen them at polling stations. There are people wearing the Iranian flag, and black draped women going to the polling, voting for themselves, voting for their way of life. So right there is probably half of the electorate, and then the other half, as we sometimes do in this country, voted holding their nose, voted in this weird situation, like, what else can I do? How else can I bring change? I mean, those are people in Iran, they're stuck in that oppressive regime, and they don't know what else to do. They tried to have several uprisings and harshly put down, in jail, killed, tortured, and the very few that voted. It just looks like intuitively to me as they're doing it because out of desperation. And now you mentioned the ethnic background of Pezeshkian, which is fascinating. At least to me, Kurdish, Azeri background. Farsi wasn't even his mother tongue, and he's a surgeon. I mean, that is an unusual mix. Like you say, maybe he'll be more sympathetic towards the Kurdish population in Iran, which has been one of the highest numbers of oppressed people. They don't even give them like registration cards, and all the last people that were killed and tortured in that part of with the uprising are all Kurds.
Right.
So talk about a message, even if it's trumped up, they're definitely trying to, the regime is excellent at placating the masses and distracting them with shiny pennies or shiny things to calm them, because their number one objective isn't obviously democracy or even Islamic ideology. It's maintaining power.
Right.
And it sounds like this election helped them maintain power, at least for a little bit longer. But my question about from an electoral system, when you look at Middle East elections, Iranian, elsewhere, is this legitimacy issue. Even if they suffered just terrible, polling numbers and what have you, I mean, illegitimacy doesn't necessarily lead them to dissolve and go to Venezuela or Argentina. I mean, where does that break come? I mean, so illegitimate and yet still in power. Where does it transition to, we're a failed state, we can't run this country anymore?
Well, they're walking a fine line, because in the past you had Khatami in the 90s and early 2000s. You had Rouhani from 2013 to 2021. They won with high voter turnout, 60 to 70% that the Islamic Republic could boast of. I mean, higher than even, advanced European countries, the United States. And now that game is over. And even if Pezeshkian can kind of distract from some extent and give, the Islamic Republic a more palatable image, a more positive image, that could be very fleeting. I mean, they're still walking, in my opinion, on very shaky ground. And it becomes dangerous, right? Because they could hold out, like you said, this shiny instrument and say, the economy is going to potentially improve if management gets better. We're going to relax some of these restrictions that led to these protests. The ethnic minorities may get more rights. But if that doesn't happen, which these promises were also made, I remember during Rouhani's campaign, and if that doesn't happen yet again, and even Khatami to some extent made those promises, these unmet expectations combined with increasing legitimacy crisis, it's just going to get worse. And particularly at such a fragile stage, we have so much external pressure with the United States and Israel in this Gaza conflict, where you have, again, if it becomes combustible again internally during this succession phase with the supreme leader, because now the question is, who are the candidates for that? I mean, clearly not, Pezeshkian like Raisi was.
Right.
So I think they're still very much on shaky ground, and unless there's like some meaningful systemic change and a turnaround in some of these domestic and foreign policies, things are not going to be looking much better for them, and even worse potentially, 4 years down the road.
Right. A couple of things. Pezeshkian, like you say, is not a candidate to succeed the supreme leader. So by this maneuver, conspiracy, Khamenei got rid of his potential successor or competition, placated the masses. I mean, he won. It seems like, forget whoever is president, he won, at least for a few more years to maintain the system. And also, I don't know Pezeshkian, or his particular inclinations, but is he the type of person to take on the IRGC? Because Ahmadinejad, if you recall, I mean, he made a big deal about having smoking guns and documents and incriminating evidence against the regime if they ever tussled with him. It seems like Pezeshkian is not that type of guy, and he's not going to take on the establishment head on. Which means more of the same.
Well, this is what I would say, because this is actually going to be, Raisi is an outlier in terms of the one president since 1979 who was on good terms. I mean, really was the right-hand man, a protege of the supreme leader, right? And they were just kind of in sync, and Raisi was not going to rock the boat, was not going to bite the hand that feeds him. Right. So now we're back to a situation where tensions can emerge between the president and the supreme leader, which has consistently happened time and again, even with Ahmadinejad, right? A hardliner, particularly in his second term, was really rubbing the supreme leader the wrong way. To the extent I think Khamenei dismissed some of his cabinet ministers, which he has the right to do under the Iranian constitution. But I think, what was very interesting, Pezeshkian said, I will respect the supreme leader's authority, right? On one hand. On the other hand, he said, if anyone tries to undermine me, I'm going to resign and we'll go to the streets, right? We'll go, he understands that there's a legitimacy crisis here, right? And that there's a card he can play by saying, okay, you're not going to play the game with me. I'm going to, resign and we'll let the people have their voice, is the way he framed it. So, he's already sending signals that he's not just going to roll over for the regime, for the clerics, the oligarchs, and the military. He could play the legitimacy card to his advantage. If he has enough of a popular constituency, as others did, including politicians who are currently under house arrest, that he could go in that direction is what he, very subtly, or maybe not so subtly, threatened.
Right. It's I mean, who knows? I mean, I hope the best for the Iranian people. I hope change is coming. But the diaspora and the great many Iranians in Iran are so suspicious of this regime. It's very hard to read the tea leaves, kissing the ring, as you said, whatever the supreme leader says, versus effecting change is a monumental Herculean task. And it's hard to, especially given so many failed attempts at change, if this person will have the runway necessary to effect change in the time and the very complex environment he's got to operate in. U.S. pressure, Israeli pressure, Iranian pressure, internal pressure, people pressure, internal pressure. I mean, I don't know what success looks like in the few seconds we have left. If you have any parting words, we'll conclude this segment of the talk and we'll jump into U.S. presidential elections later.
No, I fully understand the cynicism, because at the end of the day, Pezeshkian is on an island, essentially, in the executive branch, or the presidency, essentially, just one of a dual executive system, right? And forget, just put aside the supreme leader's office and all these other institutions, the IRGC. I mean, the fact is that the parliament and the judiciary are still controlled by conservative and hardliners. So he's really on an island, and unless there's some, let's say pragmatic conservatives like Kalibaf, who placed third in the election, and who would want to see, perhaps re-engagement with the West and try at some type of economic amelioration for Iran. And again, that's going to be determined by who the next U.S. president is, which is a perfect segue into our next conversation. Then Iranians have to really temper their expectations in terms of how much Pezeshkian can deliver. I mean, he is just very, very constrained in terms of where he is in the system.
Thank you so much, Professor Eric Lobb from Florida International University. We'll talk about the U.S. presidential elections next. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.